Welcome back to Torcido Mystery Theater. Today we're going to be talking about our GABF gold medal winning Mexican lager, Torcido. It's one of my favorite beers. It's near and dear to my heart. Normally we start talking a little bit about the history of the beer, but today I think I need to crack the can. Oh, it's so good. Let's get to tasting it. This beer uses Viking Pilsner malt. It's actually a Polish malt that is said to be the base malt for both Carlsberg and Heineken. So you get an extremely light lager continental flavor profile. I use Crystal hops, which is an American noble-like variety with just a little citrus to it, and some Saaz, all in the kettle. Completely different than our IPAs that use mostly Whirlpool and dry hop. These go in the boil. You get some grassiness, almost that metallic note that you associate with German or even Mexican lagers. Extremely dry, it's very light, it's clear. Look how pale that color is. This is also the first time we spunded it, which means we closed the tank off during fermentation to let it naturally carbonate. I used to not do that to let all the sulfur leave the beer, but as we've gotten more familiar with the yeast, we've realized that as long as you ferment it hard and fast, you can keep it spunded. So you have this beautiful head retention and lacing. Does this beer contain corn? Absolutely. But it doesn't taste like corn. Corn is in there as a fermentable. It just provides a very light sugar that actually helps keep the beer light and provides actually a little bit of sweetness that isn't a corn sweetness. That's to balance out the extremely light and pale base malt that is that Viking Pilsner malt. Go to morebeer.com if you want to get some Viking malt. They're the US supplier. Shout out to them. They're the ones that turned us onto the malt, and it's a killer malt. Torcido was kind of born out of a weird necessity. It was kind of a necessity in our production schedule. At the time, we were making these beautiful Pilsners. We were making very crispy, hoppy, floral, bitter German Pilsner style beers, alongside our Kolsch, which was the everyday drinker, no fuss, easy to pick up beer. And we made a decent Kolsch, but we didn't make it very often. Our production schedule had to be based around keeping that yeast alive. Keeping a Kolsch yeast and a lager yeast and two different IPA yeasts and probably a Saison yeast all alive at once when we only had 8 tanks. It was pretty hard. And so the idea came about to make something much lighter that I would just pound after work, something light, something refreshing. My go-to beer at home, it's Modelo, and Modelo to me is just an easygoing, easy to get beer. It's better than most of the American macros. There's something about Mexican lagers that just hit the sweet spot of balance, flavor, and drinkability. Of course, you have to have a spin on it, so I originally called it a Mexican Helles. Stepping backwards a bit, what is a Mexican lager? When I was coming up with the idea for this beer, I bought every lager book there was out there. And by the time you get to the what is a Mexican lager section, it basically just says Mexican lagers exist. There's no real definition. And part of the reason is that Mexican lagers are really just Austrian lagers that are brewed in Mexico. There was an emperor in Mexico named Maximilian from Austria. He was the first and only emperor of Mexico. He brought polka music and beer. So Vienna lager is huge in Mexico because those are the kinds of beers you would brew in Austria, along with these kinds of light, pale lagers. Mexico is a great place for these kinds of beers. The water is extremely soft, but you have to use North American malt. Not to say that this Viking is less flavorful, but it doesn't carry the bread and honey that, say, a Weyermann Pilsner will. So you're starting with a much softer base, a cleaner malt profile, and potentially some adjuncts, some rice or corn, depending on what you had available. And the hops are minimal because they probably weren't getting them super fresh. It's kind of a weird in-between what we consider a macro lager today and a Helles. I was on my couch in 2019 watching the GABF award ceremony and seeing all of our beers go by, didn't win. And when this beer came up, they announced bronze, they announced silver, and I thought it was a lost cause. And then they announced this beer, Torcido, winning for the International Style Pilsner. And not that we didn't know we were making good beer, but it was a kind of validation that we were doing something really good here and to keep on pushing. And it made me just more confident in our brewing. And I think that's kind of led to our lager program growing. If you come in, drink any of our lagers, you'd be blown away by how different and consistent they are across the board. We're consistently good, but different for every style. We don't have a flagship. Even this beer, we only make it 2 to 3 times a year. But that's because there's so much more to explore in lager, and everyone here gets to brew one. Tips for brewing this beer at home. I think as homebrewers, we love to experiment. We love to push boundaries, but this beer is all about restraint. trying to hit that lower ABV, mashing low, mashing for a long time to make sure those enzymes can really convert everything, especially that corn that you throw in. Lean back on the hops, don't use so much. It's kind of weird to say, but it's using one of the least amount of hops in any beer we make. They still come through because that base and that body is so light. So to have that light drinkability, you gotta make sure you get the beer dry, just hold back on the hops. As for yeast, we use a German yeast, Weidenstephaner 3470. It is extremely versatile, it's extremely clean, and I actually ferment this beer warm. That yeast can handle a lot, and so fermenting at 65 degrees will get you not only fermented quickly, but it'll make sure it drives out a ton of sulfur. So just make sure you have a large, healthy pitch of German lager strain, ferment it warm, and you'd be surprised at the results you can get. That concludes today's episode of Torcido Mystery Theater. Come by today, drink some Torcido, drink it next week. Weather's getting warmer, it's gonna be perfect for anything you wanna do.
Not too distant future.